So a lot of the mindful art practices not only gave me space to explore that grief as well, and kind of the grief of what had changed in my world rather abruptly at the time, but also gave me...
Oh dear, oh dear, oh dear. Listeners, I've messed up actually, because we are now live. But you know what? The guest, as always, I do not have a clue about them. I'm just meeting them for the first time. I don't know their backstory. I don't know what they do as a business. But I'm now looking at this beautiful lady's name and I'm thinking, how do I pronounce it? Is it Cynthia Hauk? Is it Cynthia Hauk?
Yes, Cynthia Hauk, like the bird.
You know what? I should have said nothing. I should have just blagged it. But too late now. I've been called out. Cynthia, welcome. How are you?
Thank you for having me. I'm great. Yeah, how are you today?
Oh, I'm doing really well actually, and I'm always excited to speak to someone new because I'm lonely like that. And I'm in this place all by myself, and hence why I do these podcasts. That's not true. I just like having a great conversation and meeting new people. So we're going to do that today once again, and we're going to ask you, what do you do in a business to help people in your successful way, and we'll take it from there.
Yeah, absolutely. So I mostly help support people who feel busy, overwhelmed, anxious, stressed, and I help them to have a way of self-care and managing stress that's slightly different. So combining mindfulness and really simple art and writing activities that you can do in just a few minutes a day. And it's a way, I like to say that it's art as meditation. And so I help support people through online classes. And then I also have a few teacher trainings as well.
This is interesting. So just give us a snippet, an example of how that works. So you're obviously helping them calm, just get to a good place in their life, but you do it with creativity. So how do you do that?
Yeah, it's such a fun question. There's so many different ways and practices that I share. The simplest way that I usually chat about it is, if you think of meditation, a lot of breath meditations where oftentimes people will focus on the breath as their anchor point. Instead, we use our art practice as the anchor. And so as we're creating, whether it's drawing or painting or writing, and we catch our thoughts that are getting either distracted or perhaps self-critical, or we have emotions bubbling up, that we have that anchor point on our art journal page or whatever we're creating to bring us back to the present moment. And that's really the practice, is just noticing that moment and being kind to ourselves and offering non-judgment. And I noticed for myself, I started naturally doing that as a practice when I struggled with my own feelings of anxiety years ago, and then just realized how easy it often can be, that easier with an art practice as we drop into a flow state, to have that be an anchor point. Because sometimes it's hard to meditate or do traditional meditation. So.
Okay, so you said, just mentioned something little there, just you use it yourself when you were going through anxiety and I'm guessing many other things. So how far does this go when you've noticed? So give us the trigger point and what happened, and let's go from there.
Yeah, for me, I noticed, I've always enjoyed making art since I was a young girl. I think for me, the transition point initially happened in my late teens, early 20s. I was struggling with anxiety. I was having panic attacks. And aside from having professional support for that at the time, I also discovered Bob Ross and painting happy trees. And I always joke, if anybody knows Bob Ross, he teaches about oil paintings and landscapes, and I find him to be an original mindful art teacher, where it's really about dropping into the present moment and giving yourself permission to create. So that was kind of the seed, the starting point for me with this practice. And then I was treated for cancer in my late 20s, and again came back in a deeper way to my art and writing practice with mindfulness and compassion. And I have so many different stories, but those were really two big moments in my life. And I've just experienced for myself how transformative these practices can be. And then now, thankfully, as well, the last 15 years teaching others, seeing how transformative it is for them as well.
Okay, so when you use the art, and you found that in your late teens and in your 20s, is there a particular way of you expressing yourself through your art at any particular time? So I'll give you, something very basic. So when certain things happen, you draw trees. When something else happens, you draw houses. When something else happens, and so on and so forth. Or there's just no process to it. It just is what it is.
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think probably like a lot of creatives, I tend to dabble with a handful of different media. So depending on how I'm feeling or what I'm exploring, I might be playing with painting or drawing or collage. I might be working more abstractly or with a specific intention. With the mindful art practices, I tend to give myself permission to choose whatever materials are speaking to me in that moment. And then depending on the focus, I have really specific prompts. So I'll give a couple of examples. I have a breath doodles practice, which is syncing up our breath and drawing as a form of meditation. So with that practice, there's particular shapes that I do that sync up with my breath. And it's also very loose. So I don't know. I think one thing I like about mindful art activities is you don't necessarily know exactly how it's going to turn out or what you will create, because a large part of it is being curious in the present moment. And also that we're focusing on the process, not the final product. So it's a different way of creating versus I'm going to create like a vision board and I'm looking for specific words and images, or a tree means X to me. So I'm going to create a tree when I feel X and a balloon when I feel Y. So it's a little bit of a looser way of creating, but there's still guided prompts and questions. So there's that container and structure as well. So it's a nice mix.
Yeah, I had a feeling that, with certain things meant certain feelings, but I wasn't quite sure. And if you've just said basically that's the kind of thing that would happen. So now I understand in that. Let's go further back. You've always been a bit of an artist, even when you was a child. It was something that naturally you would do. I mean, all children draw and whatever else, but you in particular, you took to art in a big way, didn't you?
I did. Yeah, I was always drawing when I was much younger. And I largely actually drew figures when I was a child, but without the faces, because that was always a challenge. So I drew a lot of fabrics and figures, and then started painting in my teens. And then I did schooling and took classes, so I was comfortable with creating things realistically. But then I found for myself, I really feel drawn to abstract work that where it's not depicting a particular image. And actually, when I was a child, I also was really drawn to dream books. And I remember I would read dream dictionary books, and they would say like, a red apple means this as a blanket statement. And I noticed that I was always confused by that, because the red apple, or it was a rose when I was reading the book, the rose didn't mean that to me. And so I think that that's very true for our art practice as well, is that the meaning that we can make from our art might differ from person to person. And actually, I find even from moment, if I create something now and then a week later, it might mean something different to me. So there's so much space to just return back to what's happening right now for you. And I absolutely love that about the practice.
All right. So with hindsight, when you look back as a child, you express yourself through your art. What were you feeling at the time with particular art that you used to draw when you was younger? So, for instance, when you went through particular difficult times in your childhood, were there particular times where you would draw something in a very niche way to express yourself? Did you use it to help you to actually cope with certain mechanisms? Or am I just looking too deep into the situation?
I think that's a great question. Reflecting back, I think as a child, it wasn't anything, I wasn't creating art or doing drawing as an intentional way of, I'm going to draw so then I feel better. And I think having said that, it was really my happy place. Like drawing, being in nature, collecting rocks, looking at bubbles, all of those things fascinated me and also brought me a lot of joy and felt like my own domain, my own world that I could create within. And that all still feels very true for me now. So I think it was more from that place of, it was my safe space to create within that felt really nurturing.
Okay, so you, as a child, you used to use it from a point of view of actually keeping positive and just expressing yourself from beautiful things that were around you. And you wanted to express yourself in such a way as a child.
Absolutely.
That's absolutely stunning. So now you've got older and you said you had cancer at one point and you used your art again to help you through the cancer. In what way did you use it, and in what way did it help you?
So when I was treated for cancer, I was 29 and I had surgery and radiation, and I joke that I was glowing green because I had to be sequestered from people and family for a time. And I also actually couldn't even touch electronics at that time. And so I found myself recovering from surgery. So dealing with that pain and kind of grief of the cancer process, treatment. And then I also was in my bedroom, kind of, holed up in my bedroom for a while healing. And I noticed, besides sleeping and resting and recovering and just processing my feelings, what I found most nourishing was I had a book from Sina Frost called Soul Collage. And I'd had it for some time, but I pulled out some different books and like journaling pad and some materials that the analog, right? Like not digital, that I could have with me if I got bored or if I wanted to do something. And I was actually surprised because I had that just with the intention of, okay, if I'm not sleeping and I'm bored, this is something I can do. And instead, what was really surprising is that I noticed that so Soul Collage is a form of intuitive collage where you allow the images from magazines that you feel drawn to or repelled by, you allow those images to kind of choose you. So instead of vision cards or vision boards where you're specifically looking for like a house and the word abundance, I would flip through a magazine and just be really curious about, this ocean water with a sun rising over in the back end. And then after I'm with that image, then I can kind of tune into why am I feeling drawn to that image. And for me, it was so healing in my cancer journey to have access to something that I wasn't words. It was something that I could explore through imagery that went in a much deeper layer of support for me. And so that was the start. And then later, because I fell in love with that practice, I spent a couple of years doing Soul Collage, and then I was certified. And then it, went down my additional path of teaching with mindful art. But it was just such a nurturing practice, and something that at the time I had such grief around that treatment that I didn't have the words for a lot of that. And so instead, being able to, flip through images and create a collaged card that expressed how I was feeling in the moment without words was just so powerful. And I'll say this too, I always like to clarify mindful art isn't art therapy. So it's still different. It's not like I was working with an art therapist. It was my own journey that also felt therapeutic for me. But it just gave me access to parts of myself that I think otherwise I would have been shut down to when I was healing at that time.
Wow. So it seems like you found the process that actually just works for you in so many different ways, depending, no matter what's going on with your life. What was the other things that you were going through that were quite traumatic? Yeah, I would say traumatic in your life that helped you get through things with your art? Or are there any other situations?
Yeah, I did also have experienced some concussions from car accidents and really had kind of a resetting period, healing time for myself around that time. And it really shifted the way that I was able to organize thoughts and just be with different things. And so a lot of the mindful art practices not only gave me space to explore that grief as well, and kind of the grief of what had changed in my world rather abruptly at the time, but also gave me permission to continue to explore in new ways. That one thing that I'm always surprised about as well with mindful art practices is that we can explore the same practice and it's different every time because we're different. And so it was just fascinating for me to do practices I had done for many years, but they felt different. I was in a different place, and giving myself permission to explore them. And yeah, so that was also really nurturing for me. I think I love the reflection that you gave, Ellie, of that I've found kind of these different creativity-based tools that support me in general. And I think that mindfulness and resiliency, having a mindfulness practice and a creativity practice can offer so much support for, being aware of the present moment, but also our resiliency. And I love seeing how things change on the page when I'm creating, because that also reflects to me how I'm changing and how the world is changing. Because sometimes for me, not speaking for other people, if I'm really struggling with feeling blocked or overwhelmed, or even with something traumatic, I can feel stuck. I can feel like nothing is changing, that I'm just kind of in that place. And so it's also offered me really beautiful resilience. And I've seen that with students I've worked with as well.
Yeah, and also I can see this working great for people that really can't quite express themselves verbally. That happens quite a lot, especially when something quite traumatic has happened in their life. And it takes time to be able to express yourself. And even when it comes to people, for instance, having a stroke, and they're in a position when they can't express themselves because they can't move the arm, they can't speak, etc. And I can see the power in that, to be able to be in a position where you can actually express yourself through pictures, images, etc. I see that as a massive plus. Have you ever come across and helped people in that way when it comes to people that have a problem with expressing themselves with the power of voice?
I have so many examples of that. One that comes to mind, a woman, so back in maybe 3 years ago now, when everything was happening in the world and a lot of us were needing to connect via Zoom and not in person, I taught during an online creativity summit, and I was sharing a really simple meditative doodling practice in the shape of a mandala, in the shape of a circle. And one of the women in that retreat or summit said that her son had been who is 7 years old, was having a lot of tantrums and really struggling at school, and that they had tried a lot of different things, and there were some challenges as far as like verbal communication around all of that. And that he was so excited when he saw her mandala doodles that she had created. She said she gave him materials, and I spoke with her, she reached out a week after. So at that whole week, she said that her son had gone up to his room after school and had this time that he could create his own mandala, and that she noticed he had less tantrums, that he was sleeping better, that he expressed he was super excited because it was his own thing that he was able to do. He was so proud that he had this own practice activity that he could do. And so that I literally had goosebumps when she sent me the thank you email. And I have other examples and stories when I used to teach a month-long teacher training out in Spain, and I shared a mindful intuitive collage workshop as part of that training. And one of the women that was there, she had lost her father a few years prior and hadn't really spoken about it. I think she didn't even realize how much was maybe sitting there beneath the surface. And she really expressed that doing the collage practice where the images are choosing you, where you can see it outside of yourself and then maybe add words. There's some writing prompts that she had some words come through, but she also said through dreams that night after. So there's so many different examples of whether it's that someone's struggling with anxiety or stress or sleep issues or some sort of learning difficulty or health difficulty, that what I love about mindful art is that anybody can do it. It doesn't matter, regardless of age. I've had people who've come to my workshops that have been almost 80 years old. I've had kiddos, I train K through 12 teachers who also teach mindful art, and they share with preschoolers. So there's obviously modifications that are done in what's being shared, but it just feels so accessible to me. And it is a way that we can tune in.
All right. And do you actually work closely with neurodivergent children, for instance, and adults, be them autistic or ADD or ADHD?
That's a great question. So I have definitely had students who have ADHD, ADD, and are on the autistic spectrum. I have some of my teacher trainees. So I have 4 online teacher trainings. I have some students that have taken my training who specialize in working. I have a woman who's from Israel who recently did my mindful art teacher training. And she has some elements of autism, and her passion is working with groups with autism. And so I supported her. So what I say is that the trainings are not geared specifically for certain groups. However, what we do is we focus on how can we support different groups that we're working with, whether that be at various ages or if they have certain, like sometimes we're working with older populations who can't use scissors or can't sit on the floor, or some populations who really struggle with writing, or even just sensitivity to lights in the room, things like that. So there's ways that just like how each of the practices can be modified, there's ways, and I feel it's important as facilitators that we also support the groups we're working with and modify and offer more support. I'll say also that a lot of the trainings I do are trauma informed, and so many of them kind of more blanketly help a lot of different groups because it is trauma informed.
Okay, and you say that you can make some adjustments depending on who you're aiming at. So, for instance, if someone was autistic, what adjustments will be made for that person or persons?
Yeah, so when I was working with Dana, who is the student in Israel that's working with autistic groups, we spoke a lot about, when she was planning her workshops, we spoke a lot about some of the things I just named, in that having set schedules, ensuring that participants know what will be happening, when it'll be happening, the space, the timing around that, as well as also just sensory elements in the room. Let's say if she was working with in-person workshops. I think that the materials themselves, the mindful art practices themselves, are also a sensory experience. And so oftentimes—
In what way?
So with the materials, as an example, the breath doodles practice I mentioned earlier of doing a breath meditation with drawing, I often will encourage participants to notice the feeling of the pen in their hand, noticing the texture of the page on their hand as they're moving, hearing the sounds, especially if we're working with paints, really there's so many different elements with our 5 senses in that experience that we can bring into the teaching. And sometimes those materials may not be a good fit. So sometimes watercolors, because they can be perhaps not as controllable as, let's say, a crayon. It can also be really helpful to have different art materials available with different options. So if an art material isn't working, as an example, my nephew had some ADHD and is close on the spectrum, and he cannot draw with a pencil because the sound literally sounds like nails on a chalkboard.
Really?
And so that sensory experience for him is too much. And so instead of using a pencil, then you can use a marker or a crayon. And so I think being aware in general of that there's, especially if you're working with a group, that there's going to be different needs for everybody. And so having, I like to think of mindful art classes similar to like yoga classes, where you can modify the poses and you can, pick and choose your own adventure of what you want to do or not do. And so I think it's really lovely as a facilitator to offer that permission and remind participants that they have permission, and offering the buffet of different choices. So
yeah, I really like the idea of you actually are in a position to adjust those elements that go with a particular user using it. I never knew there were so many things to take into account. I just thought pick up a brush and strike the page. But obviously, listeners, there's far more into this creativity than meets the eye. You can tell I'm not an artist for sure. But I can totally understand if you're neurodivergent, autistic, and you have problems with certain fields and textures and etc. You can adjust and change the material or change the items to make things work and adjust it. And I find that quite amazing. And I suppose people find it far easier to express themselves in drawing and art rather than the written word or the speaking language. We tend to shy away when it comes to expressing ourselves, especially when we're in a negative place, right? But to draw and touch and feel, I suppose that's far easier to deal with than trying to open our mouths and try to express ourselves. I'm definitely that way inclined. When I'm not feeling that great, the last thing I want to do is pick up the phone, right, and have a conversation. But I don't mind doodling on a piece of paper or imagining and being creative. So I would probably put that in the same lane of what you're doing. It just makes it a bit easier for people that struggle in life to communicate. And it's a good start for them to go forward. Cynthia, does that sound and resonate with you?
I love what you're saying. I think that what I've noticed in my experience is that it's so different so as an example, earlier today, I just did a workshop about an hour and a half ago, and we had about 45 people on there from a writer's community. Mm-hmm. And so some of them had a background in writing and like working on writing their own books. Mm-hmm. And some of them had a background with drawing and painting. Many had never tried meditation at all before, and a lot of people had never done painting or drawing at all, and were mostly writers. So it was really interesting, actually, I kind of checked in with them before, at the beginning of the workshop, and then during and after, around their experience of what really resonated with them. I shared a breath doodles practice, a meditative watercolor doodles practice, and a writing practice to kind of give them a taste of each of them. And it was a mixed bag. Some people who had a strong practice in writing felt really comfortable with the drawing and painting. Others felt like they were kind of a fish out of water, but were really curious about it. And so I think that it can vary so much. What I've noticed, what really resonates with what you just shared, is that I think being able to give ourselves permission to doodle or to create without, pressure. We're not trying to create a masterpiece to hang on the wall somewhere, just allowing ourselves that space to create.
Just to be. Yeah, just to be.
Yeah, just to be. I find, and they've done research on this actually with mindfulness and art, what can happen physiologically, that it can help us to come into a place of homeostasis with our body and sometimes drop into that rest and digest place. So if we are feeling some unease or stress, that we may feel comforted by that practice. And I've definitely experienced that. I think it's so different. But yeah, I'd be curious to, poll 1,000 people or something and see what their experience is.
Have you thought of putting music with your art?
I do sometimes. So I have a drawing to the music practice where it's intentional. We'll play different songs and draw to those songs. And then when I teach workshops online, I oftentimes do them without music, but I'll link a couple of music playlists in the chat. So if
Mm-hmm.
some people want to create with music, others don't want to create with music.
Mm-hmm.
And so I give that as an option. I find for myself, I go back and forth between if I have music on or off. But when I intentionally create to music, when I bring the music into the practice, it changes it. It's a really interesting, fun experience for me.
Oh, without a doubt, because and the reason why I brought it up is because music is another creative medium, and it actually helps you to express yourself. I mean, I use it all the time and being neurodivergent. So if I want to be able to focus, then I obviously may play classical music at a certain speed. But at the same time, if I need to give myself a kick, to come on, Eli, focus, then obviously something a bit more racy and whatever to give me into the mood. So I can only imagine using the art with music and the right combination is a powerful medium. And that's the point, it's the right combination, the right type of art with the type of music. You put them together and boy, you're off to the races. I can imagine anyway. And that's why I thought I'd ask about that, just to see how effective that is. And you use that combination for yourself when, you're trying to deal with certain things and issues?
I do. Sometimes actually even outside of my creative practice, if I'm working and wanting more focus, sometimes I'll use binaural beats music, and I know they have different brain waves of if you're in beta or alpha, theta. So yeah, I use that personally, and then also in my creative practice and teaching. I think when I'm teaching workshops, I usually give the option where I teach in silence and then have a couple of different playlists that people can choose from, because of exactly what you're talking about, that each person might be in a different state and place, so they might be wanting and resonating with different music. So I like giving people that choice instead of me choosing, one music option for everybody.
That's wonderful, and I can see how it helps neurodivergent people, because music is a big thing, especially different types of music, and tones is white noise, pink noise, and whatever noise you want to put together, whatever works for the person. So your art with the right type of noise or music, whatever you want to call it, is a powerful combination, and it gets people in a state where they can express themselves verbally when they're ready, especially if they've gone through some great trauma or anything like that. So wonderful. I tell you what, it's so wonderful what you do, Cynthia, because there's so many people out there that have a problem with expressing themselves. Let's say, for instance, I can only imagine if they have an addiction and they're alcoholic because something significant happened in their life. Many people have a problem sitting in a circle, talking to people, and they just don't want to say anything. But by using the medium of art and music, because it's an easier medium to actually be creative with, I can only imagine for the people that have a difficulty to communicate, that makes life just a little bit easier. Do you find that? Have you ever come across that?
That's such an interesting point. I've never worked specifically with that population. So
Addiction.
I can't speak to, like, specifically, as you mentioned, if someone was struggling with alcoholism. I will say what I've noticed is that with the practice, what's really lovely is that you're creating for yourself. And so you may end up sharing it with other people, or you might share it in the group, or you may choose not to. And there's something about that for me that feels safer to create within. It's almost like journaling, if you write like Dear Diary in the morning, and that's your private space that you can express yourself. And so when I'm very visual, so I kind of pictured a person in a circle as you're speaking about that example. Right. And so even just that shift of, you're not having to share it in a circle with others, it can be a practice just for yourself, that you can create freely within, that I think can feel supportive as well.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you could have an addiction, a trauma, whatever. It's another way to be able to express yourself in an easier way. And I can see that working. But anyway, Who knows? Maybe one day you'll be able to see if that will work with someone that may come to you, and just see what happens. And I can imagine that's going to be a wonderful thing when you see it actually works, before your eyes. I would be curious for sure. So yeah, so you've gone through a lot yourself, and you had the cancer, and you've had many other things going on. Anything else that's happened to you within your life that's quite traumatic, and you've used the art?
Those are really the ones that come to mind that I would say were not like tipping points, but really memorable moments of something that I struggled with, and also how I supported myself in those moments. I think that now I have a practice of creating and writing. I've done morning pages, actually, from Julia Cameron's book, The Artist's Way. I've done morning pages for like the last 15 years. And so now it's more of a practice and a habit. So regardless of what's happening in my life, I have this place I can go back to. And I still notice how the practice is different if I'm really struggling with something, or perhaps not at the time. It's such I can't speak highly enough about a mindfulness and creativity practice blended together. Just from my own experience, it's really lovely.
Okay, so let's talk about tipping points. Give me a major tipping point in a client of your life that was really, really difficult, which was life and death. And then just describe what was done with them to help them with the tipping point to improve their lives.
That's such an interesting question. I will say, I feel like I'm very grateful that my community online and kind of all around the world is such a supportive community that people feel comfortable sharing what's going on with them in their life. And also people aren't coming specifically saying like, I have this trauma, help me move through that. But I will say that probably because of my own experience with the cancer, what comes to mind is I've had very recently, in the last handful of months, several different women students that have been going through cancer treatment and on their own healing journey themselves, and being able to share with them and be in creative practice with them. Some of them are in my teacher training, some take the online classes, and just their reflections back of how nurturing the practice feels at a time where they're really needing extra nurturance brings me so much joy as well, because I've experienced that. So, just being able to also see that reflection outside in from others is really sweet.
Well, you've answered that, because the women that is a tipping point. Many people die of cancer, right? And if they're using the art to help them and support each other while having cancer, for them to feel like they're still consistently using the art through their cancer, they're obviously feeling that it's helping them. It's helping them just get through the pain and the worries and the trial and everything else. So that is the tipping point. And they feel so adamant that it helps them, that they carry on doing it as some kind of form of therapy, so to speak.
I think what I often hear, these few women that I'm thinking of right now, is that they mention how simple it is. I think that's one thing I'm really drawn to with mindful art practices, that it doesn't need to be a very elaborate practice. It can be, you can literally have one sheet of paper and one pen and 5 minutes. You can do it, in doctor's offices when you're waiting for your appointment or on your lunch break. And I think that helps to come back to mindful and art practice. If I mentioned meditation earlier when we were first chatting, if the only way that we could start a meditation practice is if we needed to do like a all day, 8-hour silent meditation retreat, a lot of people wouldn't do it. And instead, we can have these mindful moments. Sometimes when I walk through doorways, I'll take 3 breaths, or if I'm sitting at a stoplight, I'll take 3 mindful breaths as a way to integrate mindfulness and meditation throughout my day. And I see that really similarly with the mindful art. And I hear that back from some of these women that I just mentioned, that what they really appreciate is that it is really simple, because they do have a lot of stuff going on in their life and a lot of appointments. And so it's nice to have something that's accessible, that we can have for ourselves, for our own self-care, that for our own well-being, that we can support us.
Okay, so how do you help people within your business from the point of view? Do you just do one-to-ones? Do you do groups? Do you do corporate? I mean, how does that work?
Yeah, that's a great question. Most of the time when I'm supporting students, it's in groups, and that's largely because I like the group dynamics, that it's not only me facilitating and sharing practices, but also them being able to share and connect with each other and offer that support to each other. So I personally really love group practice. And so for that reason, majority of my online trainings and teacher trainings are in a group format, or retreats as well, even in person. I do also have private one-to-one coaching. So usually that's for students who've gone through one or several of my teacher trainings, and they're looking at, they want some help and guidance on fine-tuning their offer and workshops and marketing. And so I do private coaching as well. But yeah, most of the work I do is in groups.
That's wonderful. And how do people contact you if they need to be part of your group or do a one-to-one?
Yeah, so anyone can find information on my website, which is mindfulcreativemuse.com. And I have a contact form on there, and as well as information about the classes and teacher trainings. And also I have a couple of different free workbooks on there with different mindful art prompts. So that's all on my website. Yeah, mindfulcreativemuse.com.
And listeners, as always, I'll have the information down below to make it easy for you to copy and paste or click away to your heart's desires. As you can see, she's been using it for so many years, going back to childhood all the way through to her traumas, and using it for other people, as we discussed, even for cancer, to help them just get through their difficulties. And you can see this is a lady that's been using it in real life, in real situations, and there it goes. The proof is in the pudding. Cynthia, thank you for your time. I really do appreciate you being on here today.
Thank you so much for having me, Ellie.
It's my pleasure. And in the meantime, listeners, sayonara.